Did you know the last person to ever die from smallpox was a photographer in England? And that the US still sees at least 7 cases of the plague every year? We even have evidence that a certain flu strain escaped a lab and resurfaced in the real world. And no, I know what you're thinking, but it's not that one. I'm Mike with List25, and these are 25 interesting facts about disease outbreaks. 25. Smallpox's last stand. In August 1978, Janet Parker, a 40-year-old medical photographer at the University of Birmingham, woke up with a pounding head, back pain, and a fever that wiped her out. A few days later, red spots began spreading across her face, chest, and limbs, rising into the deep pustules doctors would instantly recognize once they took a closer look. Smallpox had been eradicated in nature by that point, so the only possible source was the research lab on the floor below her, which had been working with a particularly aggressive strain. Once her diagnosis was confirmed, the city went into full emergency mode. Isolation wards reopened, thousands of people were vaccinated, and teams spent days tracking down anyone who might have crossed her path. Sadly, though, apart from vaccination and containment, there is no cure for smallpox, and Parker died a few weeks later. 24. The first real quarantine. Do you know where our notion of a quarantine comes from? The word we use today started in the 1300s in the Adriatic port of Ragusa, which is modern-day Dubrovnik. At the time, the Black Death was tearing through Europe, and even though no one understood germs, they understood patterns. City officials noticed that people arriving by ship could look perfectly healthy and still bring the plague with them. So, their solution was simple. Anyone coming from an infected area had to wait outside the city for a full month on the nearby island of Maritime, or in the small town of Cavtat. That month-long hold was called a Trentino, and over time it shifted into a 40-day stay known as a quarantino, which eventually became our modern word. 23. Ship logs have helped us solve outbreak mysteries. Sailors wrote down everything happening on board, from fevers that swept through the crew to strange rodent behavior and even which barrels of water went bad first. None of this was for scientists, obviously, but those notebooks have turned out to be incredibly useful. Modern researchers eventually started comparing the old logs with climate patterns and found something pretty interesting. Certain outbreaks showed up again and again during specific sea temperatures, and others flared during seasons when bad harvests forced ships into new ports. Cholera is a great example. There was almost a perfect correlation between its movements and the conditions that sailors recorded. The same logs also revealed how fast an illness could move once a busy harbor got involved, bouncing from one crew to the next before anyone knew it was happening. 22. The plague before the fall. The Antonine Plague hit Rome around 166 CE, right in the middle of the empire's so-called Golden Age, and spread for more than a decade. Galen, the emperor's top physician, described it as a fever, accompanied by throat ulcers and a widespread rash covered in blisters. Some historians think it might have been smallpox or measles, but we've never identified the exact pathogen responsible. Before it arrived, grain shortages, droughts near the Nile, and shifting climate conditions were already stressing the empire's biggest cities. When the plague hit, Rome's dense population, busy trade routes, and constant military travel offered the perfect launch pad. Legions carried the disease from one province to the next, and crowded celebrations turned into early superspreader events. Rome pushed forward, but this outbreak left a dent big enough that people still argue it marked the beginning of the decline. 21. The Tudor's 3-hour killer. Sweating sickness appeared out of nowhere and gave people a crushing headache, weakness, and neck pain. After that came cold sweats, a fever kicked in, and the heart raced itself into exhaustion. Most people didn't make it through the day. In fact, the window between the first symptom and death could be as short as 3 hours. What made it even stranger was how unpredictable it was. It didn't behave like plague, and it didn't stick to one class. Rich nobles, farm workers, city merchants, and even people in the king's inner circle all dropped within hours. Henry VIII was so rattled that he started changing beds almost every night. The disease disappeared after 1551, leaving behind theories but no real answers, and we still have no idea what it actually was. 20. The June bug epidemic. In 1962, a woman working in a U.S. textile mill said something in the fabric had bitten her. She felt dizzy, broke out in a rash, and refused to keep working because she was convinced the latest shipment from England was crawling with insects. Within days, more than 60 coworkers said they'd been bitten too. The mill shut down, the CDC arrived, and the media slapped a name on it: the June bug epidemic. Except, there was one problem. Inspectors searched the whole plant and found only 2 insects, none of which could have caused any of the symptoms. That left everyone scratching their heads, so the mill was sprayed for bugs just to calm things down. Once it reopened, the illness stopped cold. Psychologists later found that most affected workers shared the same shift, were exhausted from overtime, and only became sick after watching the news. 19. Weaponized smallpox ended up in a town. In the 70s, the small fishing town known as Arlsk in southwestern Kazakhstan suddenly found itself surrounded by soldiers, doctors, and KGB officers. People had no idea what was happening, but a young marine biologist had fallen ill after a research trip on the Aral Sea, and her symptoms lined up with smallpox. Not just any smallpox either. She had been infected by a strain being tested on a remote island in the same sea. Her boat had passed more than 9 miles from the site, and the virus still reached her. Within days, other people started getting sick, so the government stepped in. Doctors arrived from across the region, ran 24-hour rotations, isolated exposed families, and vaccinated more than 40,000 people in a matter of days. Only 10 people were ultimately infected. Still, the Soviet program behind the outbreak stayed secret for years. 18. The HIV scapegoat. Gaetan Duga is one of the most unfairly accused people in medical history. Early reports painted him as the man who brought HIV into the United States, even though he didn't. The mix-up came from a CDC chart that marked him as Patient O, a code for out of California. Someone mistook that O for a 0, he became Patient 0, and the media latched onto it. Years later, scientists tested older blood samples and found HIV circulating in New York a whole decade before Dugas ever appeared in medical records. They now believe the virus likely arrived via multiple routes from the Caribbean. 17. An outbreak in the Congo. In early 2025, health workers in the Equateur province of the Democratic Republic of the Congo started reporting a sudden run of deaths in a rural community near Basankusu. The symptoms were all over the place: high fever, severe headaches, stomach pain, dizziness, and in some cases, bleeding. Several patients went from the first signs of illness to death in less than 2 days, which quickly raised alarms. The first tests ruled out the usual hemorrhagic viruses, so investigators kept digging while the case count climbed. Then the lab results finally lined up. The cluster was driven by malaria, although the pace and severity didn't look like what doctors in the region usually see. That mismatch kept the investigation going and left the door open for environmental factors or co-infections that haven't been identified yet. The surge has tapered off for now, and no new deaths have been reported, but health teams are still watching the area closely while they sort out why this episode turned so deadly. 16. 95% of rare diseases have no FDA-approved treatment. There are over 7,000 recognized rare diseases worldwide, but only a tiny fraction of them have drugs that are officially approved by the FDA. That leaves millions of people stuck, not because their conditions are impossible to treat, but because the math doesn't appeal to drug companies. When only a tiny group of patients stands to benefit, there's little financial incentive to pour years of research and millions of dollars into developing a drug. On top of that, many rare diseases are so genetically tangled that scientists are still trying to figure out what even causes them. Put those two problems together, and you get a huge crowd of patients with nothing more than supportive care and crossed fingers. 15. We've found a flaw in TB. Tuberculosis still infects more than 10 million people a year, and about 1.5 million die from it, even though we technically have treatments. The problem is that the standard drug regimen can take 6 months or more, and resistant strains keep appearing. That leaves millions of patients stuck between slow medication and bacteria that refuse to budge. A team from Arizona State University may have found the bacterium's most important weakness. They focused on a molecular system called PRRAB. It acts like the bug's internal life support by regulating the genes it needs to breathe and produce energy. When researchers used CRISPR interference to switch that system off, the bacteria shut down completely. Cultures dropped by almost 100-fold. An experimental drug known as DAT48 also targets PRRAB, and combining the two approaches wiped out even more bacteria. The drug even became stronger when used with existing treatments. If future tests confirm these results, tuberculosis may finally run out of places to hide. 14. A plant disease changed the course of Irish history. A lot of people know that Ireland had a great famine and that it had something to do with potatoes, but it's so much more than that. Ireland's Great Famine started with a mold that hopped across the Atlantic and found perfect conditions waiting for it. Called Phytophthora infestans, it wiped out potato crops in 1845 and again in 1846, leaving families with almost nothing to eat. Potatoes weren't just a side dish. For the rural poor, it was their entire diet, which meant the blight didn't just ruin a harvest, it ruined lives. Roughly 1 million people died, and another 2 million escaped however they could, often in ships so overcrowded that the journey itself became a gamble. The disaster deepened anger toward British rule and fed the political push for independence that came afterward. Ireland has never recovered its pre-famine population. 13. The bubonic plague is still among us. Most people are under the impression that the plague disappeared centuries ago, but the United States still logs about 7 cases a year. The bacteria still circulate in rodent colonies across the Southwest, especially in prairie dogs, and fleas pass it along to pets and hikers who get too close. States like New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Oregon actually see most of the activity. When someone does get infected, the symptoms look a lot like the old descriptions: fever, chills, and those painful swollen lymph nodes. The real game changer is that modern antibiotics can stop the infection as long as doctors catch it early. 12. The Cutter vaccine incident. The United States launched its first polio vaccine program in 1955 with huge public support, only for it to crash almost immediately. Cutter Laboratories, a small California manufacturer, released vaccine lots that were supposed to contain killed virus, but didn't. The inactivation step failed, so thousands of children received doses that exposed them to live polio virus. Nearly 40,000 kids developed polio, about 200 were left permanently paralyzed, and 10 died. The fallout forced regulators to rewrite the rulebook, and vaccine manufacturers have operated under those tighter controls ever since. 11. Ebola's modern era explosion. Ebola first appeared in 1976, and every theory about its origin points toward human contact with infected bats and primates somewhere in Central Africa. The early symptoms look tame enough, just a fever, headache, and muscle pain. But the disease quickly turns violent. Patients often develop internal bleeding that leads to vomiting or coughing blood, and the virus spreads through direct contact with bodily fluids. One strain is so deadly that it kills nearly 3 out of every 4 people who catch it. From 2013 to early 2016, West Africa faced the worst outbreak ever recorded. More than 28,000 people were infected, and over 11,000 died, overwhelming hospitals that were already stretched thin. Several countries outside Africa saw isolated cases too, including 4 here in the US, all of whom were immediately quarantined. 10. The outbreak that hid in a hotel AC. In the summer of 1976, thousands of American Legion members packed into Philadelphia's Bellevue Stratford Hotel to celebrate the nation's bicentennial. Days later, veterans across several states began falling sick with a violent pneumonia, and the death toll climbed fast. Doctors ruled out every usual suspect, even swine flu, which set off fears of a new pandemic. It took nearly 6 months before researchers finally cracked it. A bacterium no one had ever seen before was growing inside the hotel's cooling tower and drifting through the ventilation system. They nicknamed it Legionella pneumophila, and once it was identified, the pieces finally lined up. The bacteria had been spreading through the building's air circulation, carried by mist from the cooling tower. By the time investigators were done tallying the cases, 221 people had been infected and 34 had died. The fallout hit the Bellevue Stratford so hard that it eventually closed its doors. 9. The current cholera pandemic began in 1961 and never stopped. While the rest of the world moved on, cholera never really left. The bacteria spread when contaminated water is swallowed, and once someone is exposed, symptoms can appear in as little as 2 hours. Dehydration hits hard, followed by vomiting and relentless diarrhea, and without treatment, the disease can take a life before the day is over. The US hasn't seen a major outbreak since 1866, when large cities lost as much as 10% of the population. But that drop came from better sanitation, not from the bacteria disappearing. Preventing cholera today still relies on the same fundamentals: clean water infrastructure, steady access to hygiene services, and selective vaccination in areas where the disease continues to circulate. 8. Tasmanian devils face a contagious cancer outbreak. Tasmanian devils have been battling something far stranger than a virus or a bacterium. In 1996, researchers documented a transmissible cancer that spreads from one devil to another through bites, which happen constantly during fights and mating. The tumor cells don't just trigger cancer, they physically move from one animal into the next, and because the devils are so closely related, their immune system usually fails to recognize the invaders. Since the disease appeared, wild populations have crashed by roughly 80%, with some regions losing more than 90% of their devils. The tumors are always fatal, and no cure exists. 7. The Great Fire of London may have helped end the plague. London's last big bout of bubonic plague hit in 1665, and it wiped out roughly a fifth of the city. Then, something odd happened. The fire destroyed the rat-infested, cramped medieval housing that may have harbored the fleas and bacteria. People living through it didn't connect the two events, but later historians pointed out that the timeline matches a little too well. The plague had already started fading early in 1666, but once the fire ripped through the city that September, new cases dropped off almost completely. The rebuilt streets were also wider, cleaner, and far less welcoming to rodents. London never suffered a major plague outbreak again. 6. America's most famous typhoid outbreak. Typhoid is one of those infections that can move through a community without giving the carrier any warning at all. The bacteria grow in the blood and intestines, and most cases bring a high fever, stomach pain, headaches, or constipation. Some patients even develop a rash with small rose-colored spots. The most famous American outbreak happened in 1906, and it was caused by Mary Mallon, the cook later known as Typhoid Mary. She never felt sick, but she carried the bacteria and passed them on to at least 53 people through her cooking jobs. Authorities quarantined her more than once, but she kept returning to kitchen work until the city finally placed her in a permanent isolation where she spent the last 23 years of her life. 5. Guinea worm disease is being eradicated without a vaccine. Guinea worm disease used to affect millions of people a year. In 1986, about 3.5 million cases were recorded, all caused by drinking water contaminated with tiny water fleas carrying the parasite. There's no medicine for it, and no vaccination either. The only way to fight it is to stop people from swallowing the larvae in the first place. The Carter Center set out to do exactly that, teaching communities to filter their water and helping them protect wells and ponds from contamination. They've made almost impossible progress. During 2024, the world only saw 14 human cases, which is a 99.99% drop. If it keeps going, guinea worm will become the second human disease ever eradicated after smallpox, and the first wiped out entirely through behavior change and public health work alone. 4. There was an outbreak that rivaled the Black Death. When Europeans reached the Americas, diseases followed. One of the deadliest hit Mexico between 1545 and 1550. Indigenous communities called it Cocoliztli, which translates to pestilence, and the symptoms were horrific. People developed extreme fevers, bled from multiple sites, and their skin turned yellow. Whatever the illness was, it devastated the population. Up to 15 million people died in 5 years, roughly 80% of the region's inhabitants. DNA evidence finally gave historians a clue. Tests from burial sites revealed Salmonella paratyphi, a strain of enteric fever that likely reached Mexico after Europeans landed. Then, another outbreak rolled in during 1576 and broke whatever communities were left. Taken as a whole, the two epidemics reached a level of destruction that matches that of the Black Death. 3. Whooping cough still infects 16 million people a year. Whooping cough earned the title the 100-day cough because the symptoms can drag on for 10 weeks or more. It's caused by bacteria that latch onto the airways and spread through the droplets we breathe out when we sneeze or cough. At first, the illness looks harmless, but then the coughing fits start. They can be so forceful that people vomit or crack ribs, and the high-pitched whoop that follows each attack is the giveaway. Vaccines help a lot but aren't perfect, so mild cases can still slip through. And while the United States rarely sees large outbreaks anymore, the early 2010s brought one of the worst in decades. California recorded nearly 10,000 cases and 10 infant deaths, many linked to misdiagnosis and falling vaccination rates. Worldwide, about 16 million people get whooping cough every year, and tens of thousands die from it, mostly in countries with limited medical resources. 2. The 1977 Russian flu. In 1977, a flu strain appeared that made scientists stop in their tracks. H1N1 suddenly reappeared after being gone for more than 20 years, and it looked almost exactly like the version that circulated in 1950. Now, it's important to note that viruses don't stay that still. They mutate constantly, so the lack of evolution raised every eyebrow in the room. The most likely explanation was that the virus had been frozen or preserved somewhere, probably during research or vaccine work, and made its way back into the public. The outbreak hit the USSR and China first, which is why people started calling it the Russian flu. Older adults were mostly fine because they'd been exposed to similar strains long ago, but children and young adults got sick in large numbers. Today, virologists generally agree that the 1977 H1N1 outbreak was man-made and, in all likelihood, an unintended consequence of Cold War-era influenza research. 1. The meteor crash that led to an unsolved health mystery. Late one night in 2007, a meteorite slammed into the ground near the Peruvian town of Caracas with so much force that a man riding his bicycle got thrown off by the shockwave. Witnesses saw a column of fire rising hundreds of meters into the sky, but once everything settled, it looked like the town had gotten lucky. Nobody was burned or injured. Then, the sickness started. Within days, about 200 people who had walked out to see the crater developed pounding headaches, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. The town's medical center couldn't keep up, so doctors had to set up tents around the building, treating patients in rooms with shattered windows. Everything that happened to the people is still debated to this day. Some researchers think the impact may have released arsenic-contaminated water or toxic gases. Others dismiss that idea, pointing out that most meteorites aren't hot enough to boil groundwater. Whatever it was, everyone who got sick recovered quickly, and no chronic issues were ever reported. The whole thing turned out to be a one-time event that died off as suddenly as it started. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for watching, and seriously, thank you for being here. If you really want to keep going, our related video digs into the strange world of unexplained illnesses. 25 chilling unexplained diseases that will keep you up at night has everything from mysterious chronic pain to eyeball issues that absolutely nobody asked for. That link should pop up any second now. And if you haven't done it already, please show the channel some love with a like, comment, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Oh, don't forget the notification bell, and I'll catch you next time.